Okay, so what you're looking at is a rather large database, not that it can't be a whole lot larger, but it has 11 different columns or fields of data. And if you take a look at, if I go down in here, this has over 2,000 records here, and it has information about salesperson and order and date and shipped and product name and country and so forth. So it's lots of information. And the idea of a pivot table is that you have a database. Usually it's used when you have a large database of information. And you need to show somebody a report or present information to a group that shows how is this particular sales group doing in this particular area. And if there are thousands of records, it's very hard for people to make sense of it. They're looking at a whole forest and they can't see the trees. So although you could use a filtering to filter certain records, that does not really allow you to filter the fields. And so a lot of times we have many fields. This has 11. We could have 20, 30 fields. And so it's very confusing for people to try and make sense of it. So a pivot table, the whole idea is to narrow down the information that you're showing for a particular purpose so that you're making the point you want to make. You're not altering the information, you're just showing a specific portion of it that's important at the current time. So it's also very dynamic. Now, in order to show you how to create a pivot table, I'm going to go to something that's a little bit simpler, smaller little database here. No, this is the same one. What? Oh, I see. We have multiple screens here, and I'm not. Okay, we're having a little technical difficulty in getting the right screen that will show for you. Okay. Thank you, Nancy. Here we go. Okay, so here is a smaller database with only 8 fields, and it only has about 70 records or so. So it's a little bit easier for the initial, here's how you do a pivot table to understand. So we have different sales reps that are selling various products in locations that are all Australian provinces. And there are categories of these products like computers and printers, and then specific models underneath those categories. And then there are sales numbers for April, May, June, and the total for that quarter, for the second quarter. And so even though this is not a very large database, still, if I was going to say to you, well, how are we doing with the computers that we're selling in Queensland and who's selling them? And it still might be, I'm not interested in the details of the months, I just want a total. It still might be a little bit difficult for somebody to see that. So the idea is to create a table that allows us to zero in on the key issues. So you just have to be clicked anywhere in the table, and it has to be contiguous, meaning do not leave a blank row under the headings because it looks good. Do not leave a blank column before you have the totals because it looks nice. You need to have it all contiguous because that's how Excel picks it up. And then you go to the Insert tab, and all the way on the left in the Insert tab is Pivot Table. So I'm going to click on Pivot Table, and it's going to come up with a box asking me, is this the right range? And as long as it's contiguous, it will be the correct range. And also, where would you like that table to be? That you have a choice to put it on the existing worksheet, which is usually a very poor choice. You want to put it on its own worksheet. So that's the default. So all we have to do is say OK. And it will create a new sheet. We were on the second quarter sales sheet, and now we're on, it's using sheet 1 because that was renamed. And this is the kind of mock-up area where it's going to put the pivot table. And over on the right, you have a panel that has pivot table fields. So these are the 8 fields that we had. And down below, we're going to be able to tell it where we want, which fields in the columns, the rows, the values, etc. So if I say, OK, I want the reps, and I check that, it's going to automatically put them in the rows, and there they are. If I then say I want the category of the products, it's going to automatically put them under that. which is not the best organization, and we're going to change that in a moment. Now, the whole point of the pivot table is to show you how the values result, so that anything that you click, any field you click with values, is automatically go into this values field down here. So I'm going to click on total. I'm not interested in the individual months, and it automatically puts that as a sum of the totals. Now, we could look at the information this way, but obviously it's hard to see it all at once. If I take the category and drag it over to the columns, now we have a table that's kind of more friendly to look at. And we can even make it more friendly by using some of the design, the pivot tools, contextual tabs that show up. So we have some design tab, we have a design tab, and we have an analyze tab. So in the design tab, just like when you create a table, you have all sorts of looks with colors and shading and so forth. So I'm just going to pick something here. And I also can say, well, I'd like the rows banded and I'd like the columns banded. It makes it a lot easier to read. And I can also do something like, notice it automatically cross-foots the grand totals. I can say I don't want the grand total showing, although we usually do, but you can turn them off for rows, for columns, for both, etc. And some of these other choices will come into play when we put more information in there. Now notice it uses that heading sum of total, which is a little awkward, I think. So here, if we go down to our values area and click in the drop down for sum of total and go to the value field settings, we can change that name to total sales, which probably would sound a little better. And we can also go to the number format. Since we have no commas in those numbers, they're a little hard to read. We can make them currency if we like, but I don't want any decimal places. And when I say OK, there's the dollar symbols and the commas, and there's the total sales heading. So you can change those headings. Also, what if I'm not interested in all of these products right now? I really am only interested in the computers and the printers and the scanners. Well, notice there's a drop down on the column labels, and instead of selecting all, I can unselect that, and I can say computers, printers, scanners, or whichever ones I want, and I'm limiting just to the information that's important to me. And I can do the same thing with the row labels, which are the reps. I can uncheck that and I'm just going to, at random, check a few of these reps and say OK. And so now if I'm interested in what those reps are doing in terms of selling computers, printers, and scanners, I have it all very neatly organized in a very concise way. If I change my mind and say, well, let's select all of the products, OK, and it's only going to show me the ones that those reps are selling, of course, and I can go back and say I want to select all of the reps if I like. Okay, now why is it called a pivot table? That's easy to show because if I move the category to the rows and the reps to the columns, so I just pivot them, switch them around, that's why they call it a pivot table. So unless you have a very large monitor, this is not as convenient to look at, so I'm going to switch it back again, but that's what gives you that choice. Now, I might also want to see the location of what province they're selling these things in. So I might want to move that down, and I would want to put that above the rep. I have my choice here, above or below, because probably certain reps sell in certain locations. And so here we have the different locations, and now you can see, because I chose a style that has banded rows, that under each location category, because I had 2 items in the rows, it has shaded those, so it makes it a little bit easier to read. And we can see a few more things from the design here. So for instance, if I want to put blank rows after each item, it puts a blank after each grouping, which you may or may not like, but it gives you those choices. So I'm going to remove that. Also in the layout, because I have 2 items in the rows, its compact form is the default. But if I say show it in outline form, see how it separates that and makes it a little bit clearer, but it takes up a little more space. So you have your choice of what you'd like to do. And also notice it's put subtotals under each one. I can say I don't want to see the subtotals, or I can say show me the subtotals at the bottom or show me the subtotals at the top. So I'm going to more or less return it to the default, but just wanted to point out, so those are a lot of different design features that you have the option to do. So anytime you want, you can put more or less information in here. For instance, if I decide I want to see the individual product of each category, I can drag under category. If I just checked it, it would put it under rows, and then I could drag it over from there. And so now I have more information. I can also close this pivot table field panel, and I can open that up anytime I want. That would be in the Analyze tab here, field list, turn it on or turn it off. Okay, so that's under Analyze. I want to tick that on there. Okay, now, so I have, under calculators, I have the different models. Under computers, I have the different models. So it shows it as a rather large, but I can use these little minus symbols here to compress or collapse each of those. And the advantage of that would be if I ever wanted or needed to see the details of a particular product category, I could say, oh, let me see what monitors we're using. I could open that up and look or close it. So there might be an advantage to having them there so that it's easy to look at that. Okay, so we've created the table, and one of the other choices, I'm going to open up that field list again, because one of the other places, and we haven't looked at that yet, is this filter area. And I'm sure you're familiar with filtering a list of items, and so filter area allows you to do that. So what if I take, I'm going to remove the product from here because it's too much stuff. And what if I decide that I want to put the location in the filter area instead of in the main table? So what that does for me is it gives me a little drop down on top. And if I say, well, I don't want it to automatically select all of those, I just want to see what's in the capital area and the Northern Territory and Victoria. And if I say, okay, well, that's what it's showing me. So it allows me a different way to filter the information. I want to see it all back again. I just click on all. So that is one way I have to see that. Okay. Let's take a look at this Analyze tab. We looked at the Design tab and kind of took a little walk through those. And I want to look at the Analyze tab. So we saw that you can turn the field list on or off. You can also turn off some of those buttons if you have multiple fields in there. For instance, if I did have the product in here, you see how it has minuses next to them. So I could say I want to turn off those minuses, which would make it look a little neater, but remove your easy ability to make selections on that. You also have create a pivot chart. We're going to do that in a few minutes. You have ways to create calculated fields. So in other words, if these were sales and I also had commission to calculate, I could create a function, a formula that would actually put a commission amount under each of those sales items. So that's just one of them. You might need to move that table to a different location, a different sheet. So that lets you do that. You can clear the table, removing stuff, removing the whole table or removing certain fields. If your data changed, you needed to change the source of the data to increase the size of the range of your data. That's a way to go back to the source data and select what you need. Now this one in the middle that says refresh is very, very important. And the reason it's so important is that we're used to in Excel, when you have formulas or functions and you modify the base data, it automatically recalculates. In pivot table, that does not happen. You have to click on refresh to get that to recalculate. So I'm going to illustrate that for you. So notice that Adler here with computers, it's almost 127,000 in the computers. I'm going to go back to the data. Okay, and I have it in alpha order. So there's Adler, and here are these two rows where he has computers. And so this one, I'm going to change that 12,000 to, I don't know, 25,000, just to make a change. And of course, it changes the numbers here. But if we go back to our pivot table, it has not changed that. It's the same number. But no matter where I'm clicked in the pivot table, it doesn't matter. If I go to refresh and click, notice it now says 139,000 instead of 129,000. So it refreshes the whole table when you click on refresh, but it's important to remember to do that, or you might be looking at old information if you're, if you are modifying your data. Okay, here's another feature that I'd like to tell you about. I'm going to take the location out of the filter because starting a couple of versions ago, they now gave us a new way to filter, which is a little bit more obvious and visible. So it says it's called a slicer. So if I click on Insert Slicer, here are all of my fields, and I can create a slicer out of any one of them. And so I'm going to say location and OK, and that gives me a little box which will show me the various locations. Right now they're all shaded, showing that I'm looking at all of the locations products. But if I were to click on one, now it's only showing me that location. If I hold my control key down, I can add other locations to it, and as soon as I release that key, it will change the pivot table to show those. If I wanted to select a whole bunch at once, I can use my Shift key and I can go down and click on that. So it's the same. As soon as I release the Shift key, it shows all of that. It's the same way as selecting cells or selecting a range. You can also use that for more than one. You can set up as many slicers as you want. So if I go to slicer and I then say product, because we don't have the individual products in there, I now have the products here, and there are lots more products than I'm showing, but we don't have to see them all necessarily, but now they're showing all. If I decide, no, I just want to see the computers, I can use my control key and, oh, here's a laptop. I don't know if we have more than that, computers. Okay, so if I want to see the computers and the printers, I can click on all of these printers, and then I'm getting that information. I can certainly X out or clear the filter, and then showing me all of the products. And if I want to get rid of the slicer entirely, I've selected it, I can simply say delete. Okay, so I've gotten rid of the slicer. So I can create as many slicers as I need, and the advantage of that over the filter, as I see it, is that it's very visible to, when at a glance, what items you are filtering for, where with the filters you just have a drop down, so you'd have to look back and see. So it makes it a little bit easier, that's all. So that's a little bit about slicers. We talked about the design. Let's see if we have gone through the analyzer. We did slicers. Yeah, so this is another way to get to the field settings where I change the number format or I change the name of something. So there's another way to get to that up top here. And you can name the pivot table like you can name a range, similar. So there is a little walk through some of those. Now, the other thing we want to talk about in terms of pivot table is pivot charts. So I'm sure you are familiar with the fact that there are lots of people who, when faced with a series of numbers in some sort of a table, kind of glaze over. And they're much more able to absorb the information if it's in a chart format, whether it's a pie chart or a column chart or whatever. So we can do that with a pivot table very readily. Let me just delete this so we have a little bit more space here. Okay, so if I click into a pivot table and I say in my Analyze that I want to create a chart out of this table, I can do that. So I've already created the pivot table, and now I'm going to say, give me a chart. When I create the chart, and it's just asking me what kind, I'm going to stick with a straight column chart and say, okay. But notice that this chart has a lot of stuff in it. It's very hard to make sense of a chart with that many items that you're comparing. So I can go here on the chart and say, no, I'm not interested in all of those reps. I want to see these 3 or 4, let's say. And I say okay, and so that is limited, and now it makes a lot more sense. It's limited, and it's also done the same thing on the pivot table because they are connected, and you cannot really disconnect them, so they're connected. I can also go here to change the categories and say, no, I'm not interested in all the categories. I want the computers, I want the monitors, I want the scanners. And when I say okay, it has changed the categories in both places, again, because they are connected. So it's quite easy to create a chart after you've created the pivot table. That's one thing we can do. Okay, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to show you something else. What if I want to create the pivot table and the chart at the same time? That's something else I can do. So I'm going to go back to my original data that we originally created the pivot table from. I'm just clicked somewhere in this data, and when I go to Insert, and I go back, instead of saying pivot table, I'm going to say I want to create a pivot chart. And again, is this the right range, and where do you want it? We want it on a new sheet, so it's going to create sheet 2. And notice it has a mock-up area for the table and the chart. So if I say, okay, give me the locations, and then I say, give me the category of product, and I say, give me the total, and I put let's say the categories over here. So it has created both the chart and the table at the same time. And if I were to modify the locations, saying don't select all, but give me these few, it's going to modify both the chart and the table. And I did that in the pivot table. Now I'm going to do it in the chart for the categories, and I'm going to say, give me whatever. Give me these 4 categories, and it's, again, modified both the pivot table and the pivot chart. So that is a little bit about selecting your data to create pivot tables, and I have a few. Here's one similar to what we did. Here's one with the reps and the locations without the products. Here's another example where we've limited some of those, and here's one that has all of the product and as well as the category, and it has the locations as well as the reps, and as you can see, it has more information, but it's also a little more confusing to look at, harder to zero in. So the last thing I want to mention here is sometimes we have information that's data-based type information, and it's based on dates. The dates of when the sale was, or when the product came out, or when you received the goods is the key thing. And so I have something here that's listed with a whole bunch of dates here, right? It's not extremely huge, but it has a bunch of dates there. And what if I'm not interested in looking at the individual days, but I'm interested in looking at it by month or by quarter? These happen to all be in the same quarter, so that wouldn't help us very much. But I can create a pivot table, going to Insert, Pivot Table, okay, and I can say, okay, I want a new, whoops, maybe I wasn't clicked into the pivot table area. Okay, got to be there. There we go. And let's say I'm going to say salesperson and then date, and then I'm going to say sale. That's going to be my function, my numeric function. Now, again, this creates a table with all individual dates of the sales, and it's a little hard to deal with. So if you click on any of those dates, and I did a right click, which gets me to a choice, one of those choices is to group. You also have a choice of grouping. There's actually a group area on the Analyze, so whichever way you like to do it. And now it's grouped by default by days. But if I say give me months, and I don't want the days, I just want the months, and I say okay, notice that this is a little bit easier. I don't have to know each specific date, but I have the months for each one, and they have been added into the months. So that's another facet of pivot tables. If the specific dates are important to your data, but you want to collate them a little so you don't have each individual date, that's something that you can do. Okay, so that's a kind of a quick run through pivot tables. Anybody have any questions? Okay, let me.
So if you have questions, you can put them in your chat feature.
Okay, well, pivot tables can be a pretty involved thing. I've done a simple look at it for you, and when I do classes and in intermediate Excel, pivot tables are always the thing people want to look at, they want to know about it, and of course we could go into more detail about it then. And so I do classes for individuals as well as classes for corporate groups, half day or full day. So I see I have primary, are these used with sums only? There is a choice in the analog to change, looking for it now. It doesn't have to be only, no, it doesn't have to be only sums, it can be averages, it can be anything. And I'm just looking for the, here, value field settings. So if I wanted it to make it average sales instead of a sum or count or a maximum or a minimum, I could do that. So the answer is that yes, you can change that. See, now it says average sales. We're going to, this has been being recorded, so we will have the record, and those people who've registered will get a link to the recording.
They will, and all our webinar training resources are at uscomputer.com. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll see where we post our resources.
Okay, so thanks for everyone for listening, and we'll see you in a month or so with another webinar. Bye.